right, are we on? Good. It'd be a weird family dynamic if I showed up and they left town. It is life is full of occasions, some very routine things you do every day, or 5 days a week, maybe you go to school. 5 days a week you go to work. Nothing unique about that. And then on the other side of the spectrum, there's very unique occasions, things that only happen once. For example, those of us who are believers in Christ, it's our baptism, That was unique for you. We look back on that and say, wow, that was a powerful occasion. It doesn't happen every day. It's not supposed to. And then there's things in between. Today, we're at the Lord's table. We don't do this every day, but neither is this a once-in-a-lifetime thing by God's design. We do this every first day of the week. Even our family visiting from Slovakia is not one of a kind. We were here last summer and summer before that, So let's think for a minute, though, about those really unique, those really one-of-a-kind occasions. Not just your baptism, but if you're married, obviously your wedding is one of those kind of things. You only did that once, and that was unique. It was special. It was powerful. Once-in-a-lifetime kind of thing. Some of those unique occasions are what we would call turning points. It's the kind of thing where everything before it was different than everything after it. And that's the case with a baptism, with a wedding, That's a turning point in someone's life. And I suspect that if we racked our brains for a minute and shared life together, we would think of unique things. Because, weddings are not unique. Everybody who's married has had a wedding, except for those of you who eloped. I don't know. Everybody who's a disciple of Christ had a baptism. But maybe there was some occasion in your life that was unique that I've never experienced. Some unique thing, that you did. My wife skydived. I've never done that, She only did it once. I don't think she would do it again if given the opportunity. I don't know. Yeah. What have you done? What person have you met? Have you ever met some great hero of yours and thought, wow, I got the chance to talk to that person for a couple minutes, and that was unique, As I think about Jesus' ministry, we read in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John about the things he did, things he said. The same spectrum exists. So Jesus had some things in his life that he did every day. Walk those dusty roads with that band of disciples trailing. That was not unique. They did that all the time, going from here to there to the next place. Even Jesus' teaching, we think about some of the things he taught, and as we read them, sometimes we think of them as a once in a lifetime thing. Like the Sermon on the Mount, wasn't that like the epitome of Jesus' teaching? That only happened once, right? I'm not so sure. He spent 3 years out there talking to people. I think he had to repeat himself from time to time. And we see that even, in the book of Luke, we have what's called the Sermon on the Plain. It was in a different location, but he says a lot of the same stuff, So as we read Jesus' teaching, sometimes we think about, oh, wow, what a powerful occasion when he gave that teaching. He might have said that 50 times over the course of those 3 years, and one time it got recorded, for us. What about Jesus' miracles? Now we're getting more to the point. What about those miracles? Man, then again, come to think of it, he fed the thousands more than once, didn't he? How many times did he do that? We know of at least 2 times, but what if there was 10 times and, the scripture writers only thought we needed to know specifically about 2 of them? So many things that Jesus did. We know he worked so many miracles, and we know that certain things were recorded, but we don't know if that was the only time he ever did that in those 3 years. So what in Jesus' life, what in Jesus' ministry was truly that unique occasion, that one-of-a-kind thing? Well, okay, so there's a couple easy answers. Crucifixion only happened once. Praise God. Did not need to happen more than once, and the Bible's very clear about that. Jesus does not need to be crucified over and over because that death was effective for the remission of our sins. The resurrection, he doesn't have to keep getting up out of the ground over and over. He only needs to come back once. The resurrection was unique. But what about before the death and resurrection? Anything else? And there's one thing that to me rises to the top, even above his miracles. An occasion that to me, before his death, was one of a kind. And that's what we're going to read today in John chapter 13. It's not only in John 13. This is the occasion when Jesus is sharing the Lord's Supper with his disciples before he goes. And that's not even the part we're reading today. We're reading John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke cover that. They cover, how Jesus, broke the bread, how he shared the cup, the things he said before and after those things. John is, I think by the time John's writing his gospel, it's a little later. I think he kind of knows that story's been told. He doesn't need to repeat that part. But he gives us a lot of other context to things that Jesus and his disciples talked about and did on that same one-of-a-kind occasion, that same day, that same evening. And John tells us a little bit more, and that's what I want us to read today. And we can see that sort of unique nature of this in verse 1. So look with me at John 13, verse 1. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world, that's something that's unique. Because, how many times over the course of those 3 years has Jesus been telling people, my hour has not yet come? He kept having to tell people that. No, this is not the time. No. Everybody, even from strangers to his closest disciples, he was having to tell them, not yet. This is not yet the time. And now something has changed. The writer says, Jesus knew that his hour had come. Now it's here. To depart out of this world to the Father. And listen to the finality of this. Having loved his own who are in the world, he loved them to the end. Wow, something's changing here. Something is about to happen. Even if you don't know, even if you're reading this with brand new eyes, you don't know what's going to happen next, you can tell it's not going to be the same. It's not going to go back to, the dusty roads for another several years of walking with his disciples. Something is about to change. Okay? What I want to look at in this text today is how did Jesus use an occasion like this? And what can we learn from that for our occasions of life, for our one-of-a-kind times of life, and for our routine things? Because it's probably not every day you're going to have one of those one-of-a-kind things. But what about when you go to school tomorrow? Well, probably not school tomorrow. It's summer, okay? What about when you go to school in September? What about when you go to work tomorrow? What about, the regular things you do? What can we learn from Jesus on an occasion like this that we can do in our occasions, in our events of life? And there's 3 things, and I'm going to tell you right now, it's not rocket science. What Jesus did, Bible teachers sometimes look at texts and we want to find something unique. We want to find something new to say, something that you haven't already heard 1,000 times. And when we find it, sometimes we're wrong. We're trying to invent something that's not there. Sometimes what we need to hear, most of the time, what we need to hear is what we've already heard, what we already know. And that's all that's here today, things that we already know. But I need to be reminded of it, and I need to remind you of it. So let's look at what Jesus did. We've already read the first thing he did. It says, to read this again in verse 1, having loved his own who are in the world, he loved them to the end. How did Jesus use this occasion? To love, to show love to his disciples. He knew that he was going to have only limited time with them before he needs to go. And he knew that time is about up. How is he going to leave a lasting impression on them? He's going to love them to the end. What do we need to do? We need to love. Okay, let's look at how Jesus loved here. Now, this might sound a little obvious, like, well, of course we love people we're around, don't we? Well, I don't know. Is it that easy for you? That we can just say, well, of course. I mean, can you count on yourself to be loving in every situation, big and small in life? Or does it maybe not come so naturally for us sometimes to really love? to really show love. Because many people's actions and choices, even if they think they're a loving person, are governed more by selfishness, more by self-interest than by care and concern for other people. Caring for self, entertaining self, those things are often the things that come most naturally. And to love somebody else, that's something that we have to really think about, really work at. We won't necessarily just love automatically. Because of our sinful disposition, we might be selfish automatically without thinking about it, but we won't necessarily love automatically. Love often requires forethought. It often requires thinking about it ahead of time. It might even require planning. I'm going to go to work tomorrow. How can I love my coworkers? Because you may not just show up and automatically do it, but if you've thought about it in advance, maybe you'll do something different. I think Jesus was probably thinking ahead here. I think he knew probably for a long time that this occasion was coming, and he was probably for a long time telling himself, my hour's not yet come, but I know it's going to. Thinking about what am I going to do when the hour comes. Love requires commitment, and that's something else we see in Jesus here. This is a committed love, seeing it through all the way to the end. Not just, I love these guys for a while, and now it's time for me to go it on my own and leave them behind. No, he's going to keep loving them to the end. He's committed to them, remaining strong in spite of stress and difficulty, which he's feeling surely at this time. And all this that I've just said about thinking ahead, planning, preparing, committing yourself to love, this is all hard enough when the people you're trying to love are people you already like. What about when it's somebody that you don't like? What about when it's somebody that you don't approve of? Because Jesus' disciples, these were guys who largely had the right priorities. They knew they needed to follow Jesus. They knew they needed to try to be like him. They knew they needed to teach what he teaches. These were guys who were largely on board with him. But what about when you need to love somebody who's not on the same page as you? Actually, Jesus is doing that here too. Verse 2, during supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments and began to wash the disciples' feet. I'll stop there for a second, but notice who is in the room. It's not just the disciples who are with him. It's not just the disciples who are faithful, but Jesus, he might be the only one in the room who knows this, but Judas is there. I mean, everybody knows that Judas is there. That's not what I'm saying, but the rest of the disciples might think that everything's just fine and dandy with Judas. Jesus knows that everything is not okay with Judas. What's he going to do? He's going to say, okay, guys, I'm going to do something really unique and special, show you guys my love in a special way, but Judas, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. He doesn't do that. He loves Judas, even though he knows what's happening, what's already happened in Judas's heart. Even though Jesus knows that Judas has already severed himself. Judas has already severed himself from Jesus, and he has already set himself down a path of betrayal. Jesus is going to wash Judas's feet anyway. He's going to love him anyway. And so we have an example in Jesus of how to love even those we don't like. I'm not saying Jesus didn't like Judas, but he didn't like what Judas was doing. He didn't like the choices that Judas had made. Judas had betrayed Jesus in a very fundamental way. Can you love somebody who has betrayed you? Somebody who has stabbed you in the back? Can we still love that person? Oh, that's hard. And we see Jesus doing it. We need to be following in his footsteps, even in that example. He doesn't just love. There's more to it here. And we see what he does next. He serves them. So in a situation like this, Jesus loves, Jesus serves. Okay, I understand. Almost all followers of Jesus will say that they should serve others. We get this. We know that we should be servants. Do we do it? That's the question. It's easy to say that. It's easy to say, of course, we need to serve. The Son of Man came to serve. We need to serve. Well, can you see it in our lives? Can you look at my life and see service? Can I look at your life and see service? Or do we just see guys talking about service? That's the question. Jesus here has been teaching his disciples about service, but now it's time to do it. It's time to show them. And so let's watch Jesus to see how we can get over that hump from just talking about it, just acknowledging that it's good, to actually doing it. Move from words to committed action. So verse 4 again, he rose from supper, he laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, he tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. There's some detail there about the actual things Jesus did. I mean, John could have said, Jesus got up from supper and washed his disciples' feet and gone on with the story. But there's detail there. Jesus took off his outer garments, the kind of like more formal attire that you wear when you want to be presentable. He took that off. Why? Well, because he was about to do some dirty work. He was about to get down on his knees on the floor, probably a dirty place, and wash some dirty feet. There's going to be dirty water, dirty towel involved, and John gives us those details. Jesus filled up this basin with water. He picks up a towel. Okay, but let's get past the details. What is Jesus doing if we kind of abstract away from that? What's Jesus doing? Well, first thing he does is he removes hindrances. Okay, because if he wanted to keep that nicer outer garment on and you want to keep it clean because that's probably an expensive piece of clothing, you don't want to stain it, and so if he had wanted to keep that on, then he might have thought, oh, well, maybe I can just wash their feet from a distance, without getting it on my clothes. It might have gotten awkward. It might have gotten, it was probably not going to be as meaningful. The first thing Jesus does is he removes hindrances to service. That's something we've got to do to ourselves. In our life situations, what is it that is getting in the way of us really giving ourselves wholeheartedly to the role of a servant? What is it that we don't want to get dirty? Can we take that off? Can we set it aside, even momentarily? I'm not saying you got to throw it in the fire, Jesus didn't do that. But in order to serve, we have to be willing to set something aside. So what is it? And I'm not talking about literally washing each other's feet. I'm talking about whatever it is to serve one another in the church, to serve people out in the world, neighbors, relatives, coworkers. What is it that gets in the way that is a hindrance? We have to be willing to take that and set it aside the way Jesus does with this. But the second thing Jesus does, he doesn't just set aside hindrances. He picks up something. He picks up the tools of the trade of a servant. And in this situation, the tools he needs are not hammers and nails. The tools he needs are water and a towel. Picks up the right tools for the right act of service that needs to be done. And so again, for us, what is it after we set aside those hindrances? What is it that we need to then pick up? Because you can have the heart of a servant, but if you're not equipped, if you're not using the right tools, you're going to be pretty ineffective. Your service isn't going to really meet very much of a need. So what is it that we need to be willing to pick up, even if it is a little embarrassing? Sometimes the tool of a servant is a spray bottle and a towel for washing a window, which, Jesus had to set aside pride as well. And that's the biggest thing that I know that we've already focused on when we've studied this text, is the fact that he's the teacher, he's the leader. They should be washing his feet in the traditional sense, in the human sense. Jesus is reversing that situation and saying, no, I'm going to be the one to wash your feet. So he's already set aside his pride, he's set aside his status, he's set aside his entitlement to saying, I've earned the opportunity to be served. You guys should be doing this, not me. Set all that aside. And he's willing to pick up the tools which might be associated with the lowly, might be associated with the minimum wage worker. Who else sprays bottles and washes windows or vacuums the floor. Sometimes that's the tool of the servant, picking up the vacuum. We have to be willing to say, I can vacuum. I can wash a window. I can clean a toilet. That's not just her work or his work. That should be my role as well. Jesus picked up the tools to be able to do the service. So we then come to verse 5. He's washing their feet, wiping them with the towel that was wrapped around him. So that's how Jesus set himself up and started himself on this path of service to the disciples in this scenario. But where does this lead? Leads to an unexpected place, because one of the disciples objects, raises his voice and says, "No, Lord, you should not be doing this." Of course it's Peter. You knew that. Verse 6, he came to Simon Peter. He said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" Jesus answered him, "What I am doing you do not understand now." But Jesus answered him, "But afterward you will understand." Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Now, it's easy to read right past that and realize that Simon Peter just had a conversion moment. I mean, he just went from obstinately opposing what Jesus is doing to saying, "Give me more, Jesus." It's easy to read right past that and not realize that something just changed in Peter's heart as well. But Jesus, think about this from Jesus' perspective. He has just humbled himself, taken on the role and the tools and the clothing of a servant, humbled himself to do this act. One of his disciples objects to him. Now, Jesus is no stranger to opposition. Man, talk about 3 years of something. He's had 3 years of opposition. But who's it been from? It's mostly been from those Jewish religious leaders who are threatened by his teaching, whose authority or power structure is threatened by this popular rabbi who's gaining a following of people. Or he's had opposition from other powerful people. But now the opposition's coming from within. Now the opposition comes from one of his disciples, and not just one of those guys, that we hardly ever read about, not Thaddeus. It comes from Peter. If anybody should be on board with Jesus, this is Peter. This is the guy, one of his three that he takes with him everywhere, even to the top of the mountain for the transfiguration. Everywhere Jesus goes, Peter is one of those, even if the other 12 are not. And Peter's the one saying, "No, stop it, Jesus." This is a different kind of opposition. And yet Jesus handles it very humbly and gracefully and doesn't blow up at Peter. It tells Peter, "Hey, listen, this is how it is. You need this. And if you will not let me wash your feet, then you have no part in what I'm doing." Peter, you might as well. Jesus, who did not send Judas out of the room, it's almost like he's telling Peter, you might as well get up and go if you're not going to let me do this to you. If you're not going to let me wash your feet. Judas can stay. Peter, you need to go. That's how important it is that Jesus can serve. That's how important it is that his disciples be willing to receive service. And so Peter realizes his mistake very quickly and makes a big rebound. Not just saying, "Oh, okay, I'll let you wash my feet," but saying, "Dunk me, Lord." It's like Peter's asking to be baptized. Then wash everything. And Jesus is like, whoa, buddy. Well, no, we're not doing baptisms here. That's not the point at this occasion. The point is to let me wash your feet. And so verses 6 through 8, as we read, he completes the act of service with Peter, washing his feet. And in the process, what Jesus is doing here with all of his disciples is a dramatic role reversal, where in the world, as we've said, the great one has earned the opportunity to be served, and the lowly are the ones who do the service. In Jesus' kingdom, he flips that upside down, and the greatest one is the one who's down there serving. Jesus is setting that example for them. We need to pay close attention to that. So in this occasion, Jesus has loved, Jesus has served. I told you it's not rocket science. But there's one more thing now. In these next verses, Jesus will get up and teach. And so, in verse 10, Jesus said to him, "The one who is bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you." For he knew who was to betray him. That's why he said, "Not all of you are clean." So he's taught them that. And now verse 12, he's done washing the feet. When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, now he's going to teach. He said to them, "Do you understand what I have done for you?" Now he's back in his place as teacher. He's put back on his clothes. Now he's going to assume the role of a teacher again, because he can be a servant and a teacher, both. He's shown them that those are compatible. And so he said he gets back in his place. Do you think he might have a more captive audience now? I can imagine the atmosphere in the room when they first all got in the room and settled down, around the table, and the guys might have been kind of bantering with each other and maybe not really tuned into Jesus, maybe joking around or in their little. So at our house with 9 people around the table, Denise and I rack our brains trying to figure out how can we have just one conversation at a time, because these 2 kids are talking, Denise and I are trying to hear each other, and sometimes we try to put our foot down and be like, "Okay, guys, let's try this with just one conversation at a time." It doesn't last very long. I imagine it was that way with all these disciples when they first got settled in that room. And if Jesus had just started teaching them at that moment, he might have had a few people listening. He might have had a few people half listening. He might have had a couple people down there talking to each other. I suspect it's all different now. Now that he's washed their feet, now that he's had that little encounter with Peter, which everybody I'm sure was listening to, do you think now he has a more captive audience? Why? Why? Because he pounded his fist and yelled at them, "Hey, listen to me, pay attention." No, because he served them humbly. He violated their expectations by taking on the role of a servant, even though he's their rabbi. Now I bet you can hear a pin drop in that room as he puts his outer garments back on and sits down. Everybody's like, what is he going to do now? What is he going to say now? So I think we can learn something from that as well, that we can have people's attention better if we serve them first. So Jesus has taken his place back at the table, put on his outer garments, and he asked them this question: "Do you understand what I have done to you?" I don't know if that was a rhetorical question or not. I can't tell if anybody was like, honestly, I'm not sure. A couple of those disciples back there are like, "Can you run it by us again? Because we're not sure what's happening here." Or if it was rhetorical, nobody dared open their mouth, But in any case, he asked the question, and he goes on to say, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am." Now let's notice this. Jesus wasn't always correcting his disciples. We think all the times he had to correct Peter or the other disciples and tell them, no, you guys are all wrong. Sometimes Jesus affirms his disciples. This is one of those times. And that's important for everybody who teaches as well. We also need to be affirming people, not just telling them all the things they do wrong, but affirming, "Hey, I appreciate that you understand this correctly." And this is important. This is a big deal that they understand who Jesus is. He says, "You call me teacher and Lord," and that's right. Good job. That's correct. This is so important. It's so important that we understand Jesus. We can be wrong about lots of things in life, and we surely are, aren't we? Wrong about lots of things. But if we can be right about something, let's be right about Jesus. Be wrong about everything else. Be right about Jesus. And here he says, "You're right. I am your Lord. I am your teacher." I taught one of my classes, which I think I forgot to even mention in my presentation. I taught a comparing religions class for our students at the Bible Institute, comparing the biblical Christianity with all the versions of Christianity out there. Well, not all of them. There's no time under heaven for that, But a selection of the other versions of Christianity that are out there, as well as other world religions, Eastern religions, Islam, etc. Over and over, what my students and I kept saying was, man, these religions, oftentimes they're right about some things, but man, when they get Jesus wrong, the whole thing is worthless. You know, you can be right about lots of things, but you're wrong about Jesus, your religion is worthless. We saw that over and over again. We've got a little kid here, a 3-year-old, who has been entertaining us over at Grandma and Grandpa's house because they have deer in the neighborhood. And I don't know where this came from, but for the past couple of days, every time he sees a deer, he looks at it. We talk about, hey, look at that mother deer. You know, look at her baby deer. And then every time he goes away from it saying, pretty sure that's a kangaroo. I have no idea where he gets that from. But he's done that repeatedly. And if the kid can't figure out the difference between a deer and a kangaroo, he's going to have trouble with the animal kingdom in life, you know. Now, I'm confident that'll get worked out. I'm not confident with our world getting worked out who Jesus is. They need a lot of help. So Jesus here is affirming for his disciples, you're correct that I am your Lord and your teacher. That is really important, that they have that right. But he doesn't stop there. Verse 14, if I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. So, seeing Jesus correctly is one thing. The next thing, though, is applying who Jesus is to me. If Jesus is my Lord and teacher, and he serves, then if I'm going to be his disciple, I must also serve. I must also do as Jesus did. I must be a servant. Verse 15, for I have given you an example that you should also do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now, everybody at that table is probably thinking, of course a servant's not greater than his master. But the application here is the tricky part. Because if Jesus, our master, is willing to take off his nice clothes, pick up the lowly basin of water and the towel, get down there and wash the dirty, stinky feet, if he does that, and then I come to a situation in life and say, no, that's for somebody else. If I come to a similar situation in life and say, that's a little too below me, I'll find something else to do that feels more dignified. What am I doing? In a way, I'm saying I'm greater than Jesus. Jesus felt that he needs to humble himself that far down. I don't need to. Jesus is here telling his disciples this. A servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. So verse 17, if you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. And that's the application for us. We know these things, don't we? You didn't need me to tell you today. We already knew this. We've read this. We didn't even need this passage. You could go to tons of different passages in the New Testament and learn that we need to love, serve, teach. You didn't need this passage to tell us that. You didn't need me to tell you that. But Jesus brings it down to this. Blessed are you if you do them. He says, if you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. That's where it gets sticky for us, because we've known these things for a long time. How well do we do them? Whether it's a unique occasion, whether it's a day-to-day thing, how well are we loving, serving, and teaching? Loving intentionally with forethought, planning, preparation when it's called for. Not just letting love happen accidentally, because it often won't. Love even those, like Jesus, who are not on your side, even those who are against you, willing to love them. Serving like Jesus served, with intentionality. He set aside the things that were keeping him from doing it fully. And he picked up the tools that were going to allow him to do it effectively. What things in our lives do we need to set aside? What things do we need to pick up so we can serve fully, effectively, wholeheartedly, and for maximum impact? And we need to be prepared and surprised and encouraged about how the Lord might work when we do that. You think that the result of washing a window, wiping tables, cleaning a toilet, you think the result of that is going to be clean window, clean table, clean toilet. But oftentimes the result is much bigger than we ever know. When somebody else sees us doing that, it might change that person. And then the result is not just a clean object, but changed mind, changed heart, somebody else that is now thinking differently, just like these disciples around that table are now thinking differently, I guarantee you, after Jesus has just washed their feet. You need to be prepared to be surprised. I was often surprised. I learned to love the surprise back in the day here, when we had enough people and equipment and everything to go out into the neighborhoods and offer to mow people's grass and weed eat and whatever they wanted us to do, free yard work. And I was often surprised at how surprised people were. Like, really? You're going to do that for free? And I learned to savor that, to look forward to the next door where I could, violate somebody's expectations. Because they're used to kids coming around fundraising, trying to sell you a bar of chocolate that's worth 50 cents for $3, that kind of a thing. And here's young people at their doors saying, no, we won't even let you pay us. You can try, but we will refuse. We want to serve you. And cherishing how we would see the gears turning in people's minds and hearts as they tried to process that. So we need to love, we need to serve, and like Jesus, as we have opportunity, let us teach. You think, I'm not a teacher. You might think that. And that's fair. Not everybody's a teacher in the same way. The Bible teaches that. Some are given that gift, some are given that opportunity in ways that others aren't. But all of us need to be teachers in some way to our families. Even if you're not a teacher in a church building like this, you need to be teaching your family. All of us need to be teaching whenever the Lord gives us opportunity to speak to somebody, sharing what we know with the people that he gives us opportunity to. Teach these things to one another in the church, whether it's in the form of a class like this or whether it's just in casual conversation, to remind each other about the value of serving, of loving, of teaching. And have somebody, is there somebody in this room, or if you're not from this congregation, wherever you worship, is there somebody that you can ask and say, brother or sister, please, if you see me avoiding an opportunity to serve, please call me on it. Hold me accountable. If you see me, if I'm the person when they're like, okay, can somebody wipe that table? And I'm the one that's like, I need to go to the bathroom, convenient, right? At just the right time. If you see me not stepping up to serve when I could be serving, please call me on it. Whatever form that takes. Tap me on the shoulder, punch me in the shoulder, whatever it is, Hold me accountable. Can you do that with somebody? Can you have that agreement with somebody who will be watching your back? Not in a defensive sort of way, but in a way of saying, hey, brother, you can be serving, and I see you avoiding it. We need that kind of accountability because it's not going to come naturally to love and serve the way Jesus did. But with our fellowship in the church, with our relationships with each other, with God's help, we can do it together. Amen. And so I want to challenge us to that, to love, serve, and teach the way Jesus did. And finally, if you need to respond to the message today in any way, to become one of his disciples by believing in him, turning away from your sin, leaving it behind, and being baptized for the remission of your sins, or if there is some other need that you want to share with the church or bring before us to pray together, I invite you to come as we stand and sing.